All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for making time to this webinar. My name is Gabriel Mumba. I'm a founder and managing director of Magic Resources. I have with me Yahir, who is the founder and chief executive officer for Centralize, a cybersecurity firm based in Israel with offices in New York. We're delighted and super excited to have you all on this webinar to discuss enhancements of cyber risk management through automation. So why automation? We've seen entities over the years adopt and implement systems to support operations, improve efficiencies, and safeguard and drive stakeholder value. So with that in mind, we've experienced and seen the cyber risk landscape also change, right? So this morning, we will be discussing opportunities to assist you and other stakeholders to better manage your cyber risk management through automation. At this point, I'll hand over to Yahir to take us through the discussion. Over to you, Yahir.
Thanks a lot, Gabriel. Really great to be here today, and thanks for hosting me. Thanks to everybody for also taking part in today's session. So maybe just a little bit of background about myself, and I'll share some slides as I walk through just to guide us better through the conversation. Let me just pull those up over here. Should be able to see the slides now. Okay. Very good. So we have here just a little bit of background about myself. I spent a number of years as a senior executive at Visa, the credit card brand. I was leading a number of the European markets there on the business side more. And at Visa, I got to see a lot of the different solutions when it came to cyber risk, privacy, and those areas. And what became apparent to me was that really there was a big gap in the market when it came to tools, right? There was a lot of problems when it came to quantifying cyber risk, compliance, regulatory requirements, privacy was on the rise, and we've only seen that increase over the last few years. But at the same time, when you look at the tools that existed to help address this issue, that's where we saw a big challenge, in particular looking at the GRC market. And that's something that, you know, I personally took on as a kind of life mission here to really hit the restart button there, understand how we can address, you know, governance risk and compliance around cyber, privacy, and then the other areas of operational risk as well, with a whole new approach here. And a big piece of that had to do with automation. And we heavily focus in our company, we'll talk about it today, both about best practices, but also about how we've built, you know, and a little bit more about our solution that we've built that helps automate these processes. The journey I went through, and I'll just talk a little bit about that. When I was at Visa, I really got to see a lot of the solutions out there. And you know, I left Visa around 4 years ago, and I started to research out in the field. You know, what else was really the pain points that the chief information security officers, risk officers, and corporations as a whole were meeting in order to understand what does that next generation solution look like. And I met over 250 CISOs in the last few years. I met you know, many consulting companies, banks, healthcare, government, and so on, and you know, really mapped out what those pain points were across the market. And we'll address those pain points today as we kind of go through some of the best practices we've implemented through the platform. We built out a team based out of Israel and the US, which combines, you know, technology leaders, military leaders, and then obviously business leaders as well, really trying to address this area of risk management with a new and more advanced approach. So enough about me. Let's get into the topic today, and just talk about a little bit of the challenges that we're seeing in risk management and what we found in the field. The collection process, and that's where it all starts, right? How do we collect data is extremely manual. Looking at this collection process is something that we had you know, recognized was really inefficient in the way it was being collected. You had to create questionnaires, analyze frameworks on your own, distribute those questionnaires, calculate the score there, and really figure things out on your own. besides the fact that it was inaccurate, it was also time consuming, right? Collecting data in this very manual process with no tools to help you support it takes a lot of time. You're chasing people down, you're calling people, emailing, spreadsheets, and so on. And this is something that really was not efficient for the risk management approach. When you're trying to quantify a risk, in particular cyber and privacy, which is constantly moving, right? Yesterday's risks might not be tomorrow's top risks, and you have to be able to react to that quickly and rapidly. A lot of the goals and tasks that were trying to be met through these GRC programs and these risk and compliance programs were very repetitive. There's a lot of redundant work being done there. So just for example, if you're a bank or a government office and you need to meet ISO 27001 as a standard, and then you have to also meet PCI compliance, or maybe FFIC or PSD2 or some other standard, right? In order to conduct an assessment for those, you're basically doing A to Z, start to finish, very manually. And what we felt was that there was a lot of repetitive tasks happening there, where there were redundant collection processes being run in parallel, and that's something that we felt could become much more efficient through an automated platform. Then once we've collected the data, we've analyzed it, we need to connect it to the business, right? And that's something that became very hard. So first of all, we have to identify those gaps, and it's hard to identify where your gaps are, but even more hard than identifying the gaps was actually prioritizing those gaps. Which of these gaps here are the most critical to my organization? And to do that, you actually have to connect it to the business, right? You have to understand, which of these risks that we have in our organization are actually going to impact our bottom line business. Because at the end, when you communicate that back up to senior leadership, they're going to want to understand, well, how does this affect the business? Not, what is the NIST score or the ISO 27001 result on your assessment, but rather, is my ATM business or my online processing business or my databases or whatever it might be at risk here? Because then we can quantify also the financial damage that this can cause to our organization. And then the next point was really around, how do we focus on this moving target, right? We look at the SolarWinds attack, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in depth shortly. But when we think about that attack, that was an attack that kind of shuffled the deck, right? It changed the way we look at risk management. It changed the way we address certain risks when it comes to our supply chain now, because a whole new, version of an attack on a much more advanced level was conducted. It's a little bit like the Stuxnet attack from years ago, where there was an attack on the Iranian nuclear plant, and it's obviously apparently top of mind these days as well in the news. But going back around 10 years and looking at that attack and understanding that that attack was this pivotal moment, a really game-changing moment when it comes to cyber attacks, because of the fact that the attack did something that people thought till that point was impossible. And looking at what happened with SolarWinds, suddenly, right, we got into the supply chain of a vendor, and that was breached. And then that became a risk to our organization when we trusted this vendor, right? This actually vendor is a well-known, credible vendor that's considered to be very secure. So everybody has kind of put their full trust in them, and that served as a backdoor into many, many other companies, and we'll talk about that shortly. And the last piece of the moving target is really around the regulation piece, right? And I'm sure you're seeing that in your local environments around privacy. We're seeing that globally, not just privacy, right? There's a lot of new standards and frameworks and legal requirements around conducting risk assessments and having risk methodologies and frameworks in place in the organization in order to ensure that organizations are properly protecting people's personal data, people's personal assets, sometimes their health, right? Just for example, in the hospital industry, where patient information is one thing, but medical devices is a whole other thing, right? The world of IoT is changing the way we're going to have to address cyber risk. And it's not just places like hospitals, because IoT very soon is going to affect everything we do, including our businesses and our governments. And therefore, thinking about that both from a risk perspective, but also from a compliance and regulatory perspective is quite important. diving into some of the recent lessons learned, specifically right around the SolarWinds attack as an example, I think is thinking about these attacks are the main lesson I would say that you take away from there is that you never want to be addressing a specific type of attack as a single risk. You want to be thinking about the evolving landscape of cyber risk as something that we need to address from a framework perspective, because yesterday it was SolarWinds and tomorrow it's going to be something else. And we don't want to constantly be reacting. We want to be proactive. To be proactive, you need to have a methodology in place that adjusts and is flexible to that changing environment. So if we look at SolarWinds as an example to what I just said now, SolarWinds was an attack that took place a few months ago on one of the largest IT management vendors in the world, connected to over 18,000 organizations. Our research lab actually conducted thorough research on the SolarWinds attack, and we reconstructed a lot of the tools that were used in that attack in our lab to really identify, how it took place. And we saw a lot of very interesting things. And without getting too technical, the way that the attackers there evaded being detected for so long were very impressive, really on a military level. That's why I think that everybody kind of feels that this is linked back to some kind of government. It's not necessarily the Russian government, but that is obviously where the rumors at least point fingers to, and at least the indicators show that it's that. But it doesn't really make a difference there. The more important piece here is that this is a well-organized group. This is not a few hackers. You're talking about tens and hundreds of developers here that worked on this attack. You're talking about an attack that went on for over 18 months, planting backdoors and ways into organizations that went back, all the way to 2019. And what we saw here was that they were so methodical that they first actually deployed malicious code into SolarWinds with a test run before they actually deployed the code that was used for the attack here in a round long before. And they wanted to first see, is it detected by the developers? So they started putting in non-lethal code there. When they saw that that was not detected, they started to up the game and then put in their exploits and the code that was used to conduct this attack. The attack itself, also to avoid being detected, only activated itself a few weeks after it was installed, because they know and they learned the different detection tools that watch for anomalies, that the first 2 weeks are the critical point. So these anomaly detection tools will identify some kind of change in behavior, as will a human, by the way, because if you notice something went wrong and you think about, well, what's changed recently, you can associate it back to that new version of SolarWinds maybe that you installed. But because they waited a few weeks there and they created a gap and then a lack of direct connection, that helped evade also some of the detection points that we saw here that they would usually pick up on. And then after that, even the communication with the back door was done in a way that can be activated and deactivated through different hashes and websites that didn't exist, and also a random key generator. So really sophisticated way of also avoiding detection after it's installed, and that's why it went on for so long and was not picked up on. The results of that attack, and I think this is the end of the story, are yet to be seen. I think we're just at the beginning of the story, because they were not just in SolarWinds for so long, they were in other organizations through that backdoor for months. And Microsoft is already one of those examples that we see have come to light with a lot of 0 days recently. But I think that you can expect more and more 0 days because of this attack. That's number one. And number two, I think that what we'll see here afterwards is also follow-up attacks through these other organizations where they have backdoors into it, and then getting into their systems. Because it's not only about deploying malicious code. Very often an attack is also about espionage and collecting information, and that reconnaissance layer that comes before the attack itself is extremely important. So these attackers could be using also the information they're collecting now to think about, what is that next attack that nobody's ever thought of that we're going to plan for next week, next month, or next year. And that's why when I go back to the lesson about thinking about how we approach cyber risk, we don't want to be approaching it in a way where it's static, where it's a snapshot in time, because it just doesn't work in cyber. Other areas of operational risk, like financial risk, like physical risk, earthquakes, fires, things like that, those are pretty predictable. There's different models around that, and more or less they don't, those happen on some kind of cadence that we can predict. When it comes to cyber, there's like new earthquakes and new fires being invented. It's the new type, right? And therefore we can't predict that, and then we need to prepare ourselves. So just looking about some of the best practices around risk management, and I'll just talk about 5 here. And then we're going to go in a little bit to the CIS top 20 today, which I think is a really good kind of framework alongside the NIST CSF that we should be thinking about. But let's look at the 5 lessons here that I would say that should be deployed in all organizations. So number 1, protect your crown jewels, right? And identifying those is the first stage of that, right? You have to identify what are the most valuable data assets that you store data on your systems on, to make sure that you are continuously monitoring and identifying potential attacks there, right? And when we talk about monitoring that, those attacks, we're talking about deploying a framework there for risk management at that stage, where once you identify your assets, you then want to have different protection layers there that are helping you protect them. And if we think about the NIST CSF for a second here, the function areas in the NIST CSF include 5 areas, right? So it's identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And that's a great framework. And we'll talk about that a little bit, but also around CIS top 20, both good frameworks to think about in a methodical way how we don't miss any pieces of our risk management program. But when you think about the CSF for a second and the last 2, right, the respond and recover, what we see there is very interesting, because respond and recover actually are after you've been breached. They're not about how you protect yourself anymore. They're actually about how do you react to being breached in the most efficient way possible. And I think most of you have probably heard this before, but I'm going to repeat it, which is everybody can be breached and nothing can ever be 100% protected. And that's the mindset you need when you're protecting your organization. So there's identify, there's protect, there's detect, right? Put up all those walls, all those detectors, all those tools for live monitoring, threat intelligence, and so on. But at the same time, also think about what happens if we are breached? What does that look like? What can be accessed? Where could there be lateral movement in our databases, in our systems, where people can get into one door and get to the whole house? Or did they just get to the front door, but every bedroom in our house is locked? So they still have a long way to go. And then you also want to make sure, right, that you can also recover. And people take this for granted, but sometimes this is actually the most important point, because making sure that your recovery points, number 1, are up to date, but even more important, are protected, is something that is very, very often ignored. And many of our clients that get breached and are crippled because of this point, because they didn't properly protect their backups. So if you don't properly protect your backups, the attackers aren't going to crypto lock just your database, for example, right? They're going to actually go after your backup as well, because they know if you can respond and recover quickly, then you're not going to pay any ransomware. But if they are able to also lock up your backup, then they know they have you. And we've seen this happen almost every single day. Second part here is put strategy over technology, right? First of all, if you don't have a CISO or somebody who's responsible for information security in the organization, that role should be deployed. Not all organizations have that, and that's slowly changing, but that's a very important point. There needs to be somebody who owns and is responsible for the protection of your organization's data and assets. The second part is giving that CISO the proper tools, right? And that's where the strategy over technology comes in, is making sure that they have the right tools and enough tools to both manage and defend the organization. And this ties back to that automation piece. Automation is not just around risk management, it's around cyber in general, because the attackers are far greater and far stronger than defenders. So if we don't properly give tools that level the playing field so that we're playing on the same level with our attackers, then we're never going to beat them. And the way to get there is through automation. Mind your supply chain. And this is what we just spoke about with SolarWinds. But SolarWinds actually is a bad example for that, because SolarWinds is such an advanced attack that few organizations would have properly protected themselves from that attack alone. even if they had a mature supply chain and vendor risk program in place. The more important point about the supply chain, in my opinion, is first of all, have a third-party vendor risk program in place. Start from there. You can see that then the number of organizations that have been breached through their vendors is 60%, and that number is just growing. The SolarWinds attack is going to make that number skyrocket. So thinking about your vendors as a backdoor into your organization is a very important point. And in order to properly quantify the risk there and then mitigate that risk, you need to first have a program which evaluates the risk from your vendors. So most vendor breaches are far less sophisticated than the SolarWinds breach, and they have to do with things like open S3 buckets, credentials left on GitHub, which actually might be tied back to the SolarWinds one as well, and then things like your vendor just not properly having their own risk management program in place, not deploying best practices, not using encryption, MFA, and there's a lot of other examples of what you're going to want to quantify risks around your vendors. The fourth point is get support from higher up. Don't try to take this whole thing on yourself. You need to get senior leadership buy-in here because number one, there's going to be hard points, both from a implementation and budget perspective, but also just from adopting to new practices in the organization. And if you don't have the support of your senior leadership, then you're going to get to a point where you are trying to fight this battle alone. And you're not just trying to fight the attackers, you're going to be fighting your entire organization internally. So getting that internal buy-in should not be underestimated. It is an extremely, extremely important part of building a very strong risk management program. And then the last piece is connect the risks to your business, mapping out, visualizing those, and identifying the patterns, right, that speak both to the technical folks, but also to the business leaders is extremely important. And that goes back to point number 4, right? To get support from higher up, you're going to need to connect the risks to your business. Otherwise, they just won't understand what you're talking about. And then it's going to come down to, can you convince them or not, which is not a good way, to be trying to lead executives to the right decision. They should be led by data. They should be led by information that shows them why their business is at risk. It might be a legal and regulatory risk, and it might be that your business can simply shut down overnight if you don't properly protect it. But those need to be tied back to the business. Now we're going to go over to the critical control piece. We're going to skim through this quite quickly, but just to show you a little bit more of a, the top 20 critical control framework looks at, cyber risk. And this is, a combination of a number of organizations that put this framework together. It's quite popular. And this CSF is probably the most popular, but the CIS top 20 is, I would say, has a pretty good following as well. And we'll just look through it quickly here. So, inventory of controls, around your hardware assets, your software assets as well. Vulnerability management, not once a year, continuously, right? Controlled use of administrative privileges, securing configuration around hardware, software, mobile devices, laptop workstations, and servers, and then the maintenance and monitoring of, audit logs and analysis around that as well. At this point, we move into the next step, kind of the next layer of controls here, which is around your email and web browser protection. And each one of these pieces is a part of the kill chain. It's a part of the attacker's journey in, right? The attacker needs to get into your computer, right? Often we hear about if they send an email with a link and you click on it and then it runs some kind of script, then they're in. That might be true, and it depends on the type of attack. That could be enough for them. But very often, even when you click on that link and you've given them access to your computer in some way or another, if your applications like your email and your browsers are properly protected, it could very well be that the attacker is going to get stuck there because they're counting on the fact that your browser has some kind of weakness that has not been patched. And then as a result, they're going to be able to get into your sensitive information on your browser because often the information there is encrypted. So if you are not, updating your browser or your email clients properly, and we saw recently with Microsoft, right, that their Exchange servers were being attacked, and that's a very important patch if you've not done it. Web browsers are constantly being updated, including this morning, I believe Chrome came out with another update. And if you are not aware of that, then please definitely make sure that your browser up to date. And at this point, also, I'll just mention on the call, we'll also send out a link to everybody afterward. We actually have a free intelligence report that we send out daily, which includes the latest patches on big systems like browsers and email clients. So you could subscribe for that through our company for free, and then get those updates, which would let you know each morning if there are any updates that you should be deploying. It also shows you some of the latest attacks that are happening in the industries, and it's really nice to keep track of. Malware defenses, again, kind of like your antiviruses, malware has become that kind of new buzzword. You have to make sure you have proper programs protecting there and that they're activated and up to date. You have to make sure those are automatically updating if possible. Limitation of control, ports, network, protocol services. This is extremely important because even when you think you're in a secure environment, we talked about before that if an attacker gets in, we do not want to give them lateral movement. We don't want to give them the ability to get in and then go across all of your assets at once. A good attack to think about, and it's a little bit older, but it actually really highlights how lateral movement can really affect an entire organization, is the Target attack on the retailer in the US called Target. The way the attackers got in is that they deployed malicious code on a vendor of Target, on an air conditioning support maintenance person's laptop. And when that person came and connected to Target's air conditioning system that was online, the malicious code went into the network there that the air conditioner was connected to, because it had IoT devices inside it. And the bad news was that the Target never segregated their networks, and that moved over to their points of sale. And from their points of sale that started stealing credit cards, it actually was able to go from one point of sale to every single point of sale in the US and Canada. And at that point, they stole 40 million credit cards in one single attack. So being able to think about that lateral movement and limiting the control of network ports and protocols and services is very important so that people cannot get across. Data recovery capabilities, secure configuration of network devices, boundary defenses, data protection, controlled access, and wireless is another example. I'm going to stop there for a second because wireless is one that we ignore often. Wireless networks in general are very vulnerable. Forget about the fact that they're harder to protect. The Wi-Fi I'm talking about right now, so local wireless access. There are constantly, gaps there that are being patched, and it is important to stay on top of that, make sure that your equipment is up to date, but also making sure that you have proper protection layers like firewalls and other mechanisms of protection. If you are using wireless access, you should segregate your wireless networks from guest networks. So people are coming in from the outside should not connect to the corporate network. And then account monitoring and control as well. Last four things here on the CIS Top 20 is awareness and training. A very important point here, making sure that your employees are up to date and aware of the latest attacks. Training there, actually doing exercises, we're sending out phishing campaigns, extremely important. People need to be sharp on their heels. I can tell you that on our organization alone, we conduct that regularly. And we actually had a case where we conducted a security awareness training program for phishing. And we sent out, malicious, fake malicious email, and, got people making sure they recognize that they should not be clicking on that code. And, the company performed quite well, but it became a conversation inside our company. And a few weeks later, we were actually targeted in an attack where real phishing emails were sent to the organization, making it look like company employees were sending each other requests for sensitive information. And because of that training and people's awareness, that thwarted the attack and saved us. And that's extremely important. By us, people are on their tippy toes anyways because we're a cyber company. But when you're a bank, or when you are a healthcare organization, or some kind of industrial or energy company, you need to make sure that your employees who are less aware of this become more aware. Application software security, if you're developing or purchasing software through other vendors, you have to make sure that the code there is probably protected, that you're doing the security assessments around that. Incident response, making sure you have not only the process and policies there, but the people that can support this, whether they're internal or external. And then pen testing and red team exercises on your organization's website, on your software, and making sure that you are properly resilient. Now over a little bit to what we do, and I'm going to leave time at the end for questions as well. So I'm going to spend, the next, I would say probably 15 minutes or so going through our solution and talking you through at a high level what we do. Once we get there, we will then pause there for questions. Please feel free to submit questions through the Q&A box, and then we'll address those at the end. Okay. So we have here our solution. It's a active risk management platform, AWS multi-tenant serverless. It automates the collection, analysis, and remediation. And it focuses very much on helping visualize and automate cyber risk across 3 primary use cases. We focus on internal risk and compliance, on vendor risk, and then on executive reporting. So a lot of the topics we talked about today. And we do that through a combined method of questionnaires and surveys, together with integrations to tools in the network, and then also bringing in live threat intelligence from a team of former military cyber researchers and analysts that sit by us internally. I'm going to share my other screen now with our platform as well, and then from there we'll start going forward. Okay. And actually, I made a mistake there. We have around 10 minutes left, so if there are any questions, please feel free to start sending them through, and then we'll all respond to them at the end. Okay. Great. So here we can see our solution here. We have 3 solutions: first party, third party, and board. First party looks here at your internal risk and compliance. This dashboard here allows you to understand what are my risk levels. So you can see here I have an 8.4 out of 10. The higher I am, the more protected I am. Right, and this is showing me here, using the NIST CSF, how protected I am as an organization, and this really gives me kind of an indicator of how I'm doing versus my maturity level, and then the NIST tier that I'm on here as well. So you can see we're on tier 2 here. You have the ability through our platform to use the implementation tiers here. So you can see we're on, tier 2, which is what's called risk informed. We have a very advanced automated tool here, which can show you how you're doing versus other tiers here as well. So you can see tier 1 would be a 10, tier 4 would be 4.2. Right? And you can actually, at a click of a button in our platform, move over to use those as the primary default tier that you're on. Now, before I continue on this screen here, showing you what we see here and all the data that's being populated, I'm just going to show you very briefly the collection center here, kind of identifying and showing you here what we have from a collection standpoint. So I mentioned that we have 3 sources of data, pulling in data from questionnaires and surveys, from tools in the network, integrations through APIs, an external feed of threat intelligence, new vulnerabilities, as well as changes to regulations, which we are tracking for all our clients. So when there is a new requirement, a new draft that comes out from some kind of compliance framework, we are able to then automatically notify you that there's a change coming, and I'll actually show you how that change affects you. Here you can see that the questionnaire for each one of these frameworks is being managed on the left side here. So we can see if we click on one of the frameworks here, we'll pull up a specific one over here. And now I can see the breakdown of the NIST CSF that's being run from my Chicago branch here. The questionnaires here, I can see how many users are here, where the users are up to here. I can ping those users and send them reminders here. So instead of having emails, phone calls, and all this manual, it's all orchestrated through the platform. In parallel, I can pull data from integrations like Tenable. Let me pull that up here just as an example. So I can pull up a Tenable feed here from the vulnerability scan or firewalls or certain endpoint solutions like things like CrowdStrike, which we're bringing in now, and others, as well as SIMs and big data solutions like Splunk. And then we map that information back. So the scans happen here real time. The severity here is pre-mapped. The IP we're scanning, the result, and I can actually see which control this is affecting because we've mapped back the thousands of scans back to the controls here. And going back into that collection center for a second, just to show you a little bit about the questionnaire part. So the ability to manage the questionnaires here is really intuitive and structured very clearly. So if we take the NIST CSF, for example, we click on this one. Now what we can see here is that it breaks down the framework, right? So to identify, protect, detect, respond, recover here. As we go in deeper, we can go into the categories, subcategories, down to a specific control. And then all the questions are pre-assigned here, right? You can see that the questions, integrations, and external sources come together here vis-a-vis each one of the controls. And adding new users here is really simple. If I want to assign a question to a different user, I just drag them, drop them, and then they get assigned. And what happens here in the background is that this new user that's been assigned, JR, only has a few questions that are assigned to them. They're only going to see the questions that are being sent to them. And that helps create a lot of efficiency around the data collection piece. Okay. Now coming back here for a second, our ability here to go from this very high level and understand, how we're doing with the spider chart and different alerts here that are coming on threats and vulnerabilities, and dive into the organization details is all a click of a button away. I can click here on the score, go into a specific area here, see the breakdown of compliance versus risk here. And I can see here, I also can benchmark, so I can see different domains of risk. Technology, for example, 4.2 out of 10, target is 8.8, so I'm far from my target. I can go back in time and compare to previous points, or I can even deep dive into a specific area here to break that open and really identify what are the areas I'm weaker and stronger in here. And you can see that here, the identify, protect, detect, respond, recover comes up. My protect is in red. I can go here into, let's say, awareness and training, a topic we touched on before. I can see what part of awareness and training are red. I see this part is red, third-party stakeholders and suppliers are red. There's two controls feeding that, and automating all this, right, in a way that the platform is helping you conduct and navigate through this information while the information is being collected both from questionnaires that are orchestrated through the platform, but then through a lot of the tools that are coming in, give me this visibility and picture here of what's going on in my organization, and that is great. But you are now stuck with a red control that's failing, right? Let's look at the description. What was the requirement here? Okay. And what do I do next? And one of the things our platform does here is it identifies this gap automatically, whether it came through an integration or through a question, and it will create for you through our artificial intelligence risk remediation planner an automated action item here at a severity level, and it will take these two items and plug it into our Remediation Center. Our Remediation Center is an automated feed of tickets that are filling up in real time with action items for our clients. So it really handholds the process of what do I do tomorrow morning? When you click on that, you can get the information here of what you need to fix, what the description is, and you can run different workflows here of remediate, accept, assign to, or ignore. Or you can also use Jira or ServiceNow to manage these tickets as well. Once we finish with the tickets here, we're able to go to our risk register and look at what are the risks that we have that we're managing for organization. So what we see here is a risk register, which doesn't look so different from other risk registers as far as the information. There's some advanced heat mapping here, but this risk register actually is the only one in the world that does what I'm about to tell you. This risk register was 100% built up automatically by the platform because the platform has predefined risks in it. So we've mapped out 64 of the primary risks organizations face today. And we can, through the risk assessment that you're doing with the NIST CSF, for example, it will build up your risk register. It will create information here on whether those risks are mitigated or not. It will show you the inherent risk versus residual risk, impact and probability here, which assets are affected, which controls are mitigating this inherent risk and taking down the residual risk, in this case, to 0. Right? And then you can also even assign here financial impact if you'd like through a primary loss calculator here, which you could fill out. So we've automated something here that literally takes tens and hundreds of hours to create yourself and maintain through this process, where of course you can edit these and then also add or remove ones. So if there's things here that are less relevant or there are risks missing, you can add, but already now you have a really strong tool to automate this process. I know we're almost out of time. And I know there's at least one question or two that I want to take a look at here, so we're going to see them in a second. But I will just show you that for the vendor risk solution here, similar solution that's dedicated to vendors. You can see here the list of vendors that have been onboarded. Adding a new vendor on our platform takes between 30 and 60 seconds. So we click on Add Vendor, name, domain, point of contact, and email. You can preset or change these other settings on the fly. By clicking on certain items here, it builds out a customized smart questionnaire for that vendor. You can require different certifications from that vendor. but it's also, besides asking the vendor to go through an assessment, actively scanning automatically the darknet, public web, and perimeter of the vendor to create a very up-to-date and accurate score of that vendor's exposure. And what we're going to see here is that on the heat map that we have here, we are able to see the impact and the probability of an attack on each one of your vendors. And you can actually click on an area and identify which vendors are in those points. So this again is helping you automate that area of vendor risk management. You still need to manage this program, but now one person can manage all of what we just saw here versus usually what it takes teams and teams of people, which is why organizations that are less mature or have less budgets are not able to properly manage these kind of programs without automation. And the last thing, and I'll conclude on this screen here, is our executive reporting tool. Here you can see a clean view of the organization's risk that are tying back to different business and trend aspects. So here, if I look at risk score, having these scores here around the NIST CSF is not so helpful for my senior leadership because they don't know what these numbers mean. But once I click in once more, and this is, for example, built up 100% automatically by the platform, it will show you quarter over quarter how your organization is progressing or regressing across the 5 NIST functions. Right? You can present that visually or numbers. The idea here is that now you're giving the context of time as an element of measurement. And when you do that, now your senior leadership, even if they don't understand what identify means, they can see here that you were better, you got worse, now you're getting better. So you're actually in the right direction. Whereas if the opposite was happening, then we would have a discussion around that. And just showing you to conclude here is that we tie together, between risk, compliance, threat level, the monitoring areas around, the different events going on in the organization, right down to leaks here, type of attacks, proactive measures, really a comprehensive view, but everything is, kind of like an onion. You can peel away a piece at a time, depending how deep you want to go. And even here, if I want to click once more, I can get a breakdown here of quarter over quarter around these events and attack types. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. Hopefully you got a little bit of a feel today for how we are automating risk management here. And, maybe I'm going to just read here one of the questions that came in. I think we have time for at least one here from Catherine. What are some of the controls that an organization can put in place to guard against threats by vendor other than non-disclosure agreements that are required to sign? That's a great question. I think we addressed it a little bit here at the end here. What we see here really is that from a vendor perspective, you want to have a much more comprehensive program in place. Because vendor risk is not enough to just sign them an NDA. Honestly, the NDA is almost meaningless at the end if you're not able to, in parallel to that, quantify risk for that vendor. And to quantify risk for that vendor, you number one need to send them a questionnaire and survey to make sure that they have their own controls in place. That's not only just because you want to measure their controls, it's also a mechanism to make them more accountable and liable for the information they're sharing with you. Right. So I think that there, when you think about that, it's really keeping them honest at the same time. And we're also not depending on that. We use something that's very unique in the vendor risk world, which is called a hybrid vendor risk approach. So it's bringing 2 methodologies together. One is self-attestation by the vendor. And at the same time, we also have the automated scanning on the darknet, public web, and the perimeter, where those 2 items together are actually building up the probability score of an attack on the vendor. So the impact score you're going to measure on your own, you're going to say, how much damage can this vendor cause to me? But when it comes to how likely is this vendor actually to be breached, that is something that you want to quantify both through what controls does that vendor have in place, as well as that automated scanning. Now, doing that manually is extremely difficult, and that's why automating that through a platform here is much, much better. And I'll just give you one more example, by the way, with the vendor piece, which is really important through automation, is that helping your vendors get through this process in a smoother and better way is another goal you should have. Because if you set up this robust vendor risk program with hundreds of questions and everybody gets these massive spreadsheets and so on, the vendor's going to get it and not going to cooperate, or they're going to put in not real information. What you want to do is build out a program that tiers out the vendors, that treats more important critical vendors different than the person who is supplying you with stationery or with, hardware, like, tables or furniture, things like that. Obviously, those aren't risky vendors, but your data center, for example, is very risky to you, right? And then once you've done that, right, you're giving them tools, first of all, to get the right information that you need from them. But we take it one step further. You saw the automated remediation capability we have in our first party solution that also exists in our vendor risk solution. And what that means is that we have the ability here now to look at the vendor, tell the vendor automatically what problems they have, but also tell them how to fix it in their own dedicated remediation center. So the vendor will get their own tickets of what they need to fix and how to fix it. Imagine when you have tens or hundreds or thousands of vendors, that's a lot of saved time. Instead of you going back and forth with a kind of a game of ping pong with each vendor, the vendor works with the platform to solve the problems. You review the information, approve, deny, but it's much more scalable. And creating a scalable and a vendor risk program that's maintainable are extremely important. So my suggestion there is start small, identify the critical areas that critical vendors that are touching your business, and then slowly build out. Don't try to do, if you have hundreds and thousands, you've not done any yet, start with the first 20 and then build out the next 40. And that's why using also a SaaS cloud-based platform, which is easily deployable, helps you do this in a way where you can build it up over time. You don't need to do it all from day one. Okay, I have one more question here, and then we're going to just came in from Richard, and then we're going to conclude there. So Richard's question was, along with this tool, do you have the cyber awareness training program for employees in the organization and also simulations for testing? So it's a great question. We're not a training and awareness company, so we're not doing the full part of training and awareness for employees, but we actually just recently deployed a new framework and a platform around cyber awareness and training, which gives you a framework and best practices of how to conduct and measure effectiveness of your employee and organization's training and awareness levels. And also giving you ideas there for simulations, but sometimes you need other tools there to do that. Not everything requires tools, but you could do that. You can also build out scenarios on your own, and I'll give you just an example of that. You can set up a fake URL that looks like your company's URL, very similar, with a company employee's name, and then try to get people just to click on that email or share information with it, and then use that as a way to then communicate the results of that test to the organization. It's very important also when you conduct awareness and training is that there's a follow-up to that. Don't just do a test and check yourself. You want to make people aware, not just the people who failed, everybody aware of the results and where people made mistakes, because some people might have not made a mistake because they got lucky or they happen not to see that email. And you want to make sure that everybody's kind of sharper and on their toes and more aware of the latest threats. So Gabriel, I'm not sure if you're going to come back in here just to conclude, but from my point of view, I have finished the presentation today. Really appreciate everybody joining us. We had quite a few people here, so I think that this was a great informational session, both on how to put some best practices in risk management in place, how to use automation to your advantage, and hopefully you guys have all men and women have seen also some of the capabilities our companies bring to the automation of these capabilities.
Thank you, Yahia. Thank you everyone for making time to join us on this webinar. I know that we might not have a lot of time to go through the platform, but I think Yahia did his best to just talk us through the platform. What we will be able to do post this webinar is to, where required, is to have one-on-one sessions with the participants on the call. So just let us know if that works out for you, and we should be able to arrange for that. Other than that, thank you very much again. Much appreciated. Looking forward to meeting you again.
Great. Thank you so much.